So I've been working on a project with Dr. Singh for comparing different commercial silicon carbide fibers for use in ceramic fiber reinforced polymer composites. Kind of overview of this whole deal. We'll talk about the application of these ceramic fibers, the project objective, the materials involved, procedure and standards used, initial experiments in order to determine the concentration of fibers to resin, the actual comparison of these fibers, and then a sort of consistency check, and then drawing some conclusions from the testing. So applications and relevance. These fibers are really relevant and applicable to electric vehicles, improved gas turbine engines, kind of seen here on bottom left, nuclear reactors, semiconductors, and in the aerospace industry. Aerospace industry you can kind of see down here in the bottom right with rocket nozzles and aero engine vanes.
What part of the electric vehicle? Should I ask questions at the end or just stop you and ask?
I'm not entirely sure.
Let's just have it as a discussion, honestly.
Okay.
So what part of electric vehicles do they go in?
I believe they're being used in, so particularly like the body as well as in the engine, or not the engine, like the battery aspect of it. I'm not entirely confident in knowing what that is.
The reason I ask is like I'm not aware of them being used in electric vehicles. I'm aware of silicon carbide fibers being important for vehicles, such as like the hot sections, not the engine, but brakes, for example. High performance brakes are sort of ceramic, and sometimes they reinforce them with silicon carbide fibers. That's just sort of my comment on that.
Okay, I'll do some more research into that. There was, I forget, I think it was just an article, like the article that I grabbed this from, was mentioned electric vehicles. So I will.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well,
or it was
I was
from
working at
the website that
I did some work at GE for those. I'm kind of surprised. It's interesting how maybe I'm completely not aware.
I'm just not knowledgeable enough to know exactly how it's being used. And I don't remember if it was in, because it was an article talking about the introduction of silicon carbide fibers to replace certain parts.
I see.
So this was an example they used.
Okay, no, of course. I mean, they are huge in hot sections of the engine. Yeah, of course.
And then up here on the top right is a market analysis done by Markets and Markets Research Private Limited, showing an increase in the market for silicon carbide fibers. Specifically, this was for the use in semiconductors. So the objective of the research done was to determine the mechanical properties at room temperature, specifically elastic modulus and fracture strength, for these three different types of near stoichiometric silicon carbide ceramic fibers, especially been used to reinforce composites using a polymer matrix. So the purpose of this research project was to determine and compare the mechanical properties already mentioned for the commercially available ultra-high temperature ceramic fibers. So we looked at high nickel and type S fibers, ceramic silicon carbide fibers, and the Tirano SA3 fibers. We made 3 dog bone samples of each of those and then tested them in a tensile test to determine their elastic modulus. So here's a picture of the toads that we used. So here's the high nickel and type S, the ceramic, and the Tirano. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, if it's Tirano or Tirano.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I've worked a lot with these fibers. I've always said Tirano, but I think Tirano sounds better.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And then each of their manufacturers' information is available at these links here. However, Dr. David Marshall at UC Boulder, when looking at these slides, said that the data from those seemed a little off, because there used to be a table down there that was from the tables that they provided, meaning the manufacturers on their websites.
Mm-hmm.
So he sent this instead and said this would be more applicable. So manufacturer's data as courtesy of David Marshall. So you can kind of see here the higher elastic modulus of the high Nyclon type S, followed by the Tyranno, and then the ceramic. And then each of them has these very low densities and these very small diameters, 12 microns, 10 microns, 7 and 10. Spencer, join us.
Oh, Spencer just joined.
Hello. Spencer, just so you're aware, Dr. Singh asked us to record this, and we're just kind of treating it as a general discussion as we go through slides.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's going to be connected with audio. Yeah, I know he's on a different call, but I'll tell him when he appears again.
Okay. I just want to make sure everything was good. Sorry. Then the photopolymer, or the matrix for our composites, we used a commercial photopolymer resin, specifically the Formlabs photopolymer resin clear, as they label it. We'll just call it the clear resin, which can be also seen here in a beaker. It was used in conjunction with a Formlabs Form 2 SLA 3D printer. The chemical composition of this resin is not public knowledge. So we can just kind of observe this process for how it works, or how this photopolymer polymerizes, basically. Starting with a photoinitiator and a monomer being exposed to UV lights, which generates excitation and free radical generation, chain initiation, chain propagation, and chain termination. Basically, just the polymerization process for the photopolymer as it is exposed to UV light. So the procedure for each of our fiber resin mixtures involved chopping each of the selected ceramic fibers. This was initially done with a pair of scissors and just kind of dropping the fibers into a beaker, kind of shown here. This was not, there were not necessarily consistent lengths, which will come up in the consistency check at the end of the presentation, or any of the PowerPoints. So we chop the fibers with scissors, then rinse the fibers using isopropanol, just roughly 10 milliliters, before putting it in a sonicator for 30 minutes, 5 minutes on, 1 minute off, at 25% power of our ultrasonicator we use. And it's a horn sonicator. That's just to distribute the fibers throughout this sort of mixture here before we pour that into a resin, or into the resin, and then we'll use that resin to do our SLA 3D printing. But we'll mix it into the resin overnight using a magnetic stir at a little over 125 RPM. So then we pour the fiber resin mixture into the resin tray. We use the preform slicer software to prepare 3 ASTM D6385 dog samples. And we printed those at 45-degree angles. This was to make sure that the adhesion wasn't too great if it was just plain flat against the build plate. And also at 90 degrees, it would, it's possible the weight of the dog bone would pull it off of its own build platform. And then the printing process took anywhere between 3 hours and 3.5 hours. After the printing was done, we break off the supports and place these samples in an isopropanol bath to remove the excess resin. We typically left this overnight, or in the bath overnight. So why stereolithography? The process is quick, cheap, easy, and capable of complicated geometries. It allows us to polymerize the resin around these fibers, especially because we're using these chopped fibers that are distributed throughout the composite structure. My understanding is that it is a little easier, a little faster, a little cheaper to do than the continuous fiber reinforcement that can be done with FDM technologies. There's been some research done with that. However, I have not personally done this. I believe we have the capability of doing this in our lab, but I'm not familiar with the process. And then a 100 micron layer height was used at the fastest printing speed, which is still accurate and thorough throughout the print, thanks to it being SLA 3D printing. And then over here, you can see the SLA process, the laser bouncing off the mirror, polymerizing the resin onto the build platform as it lowers and raises out of the tank, just building layer by layer. Specifically, the Form 2 uses the upside down inverted SLA. So this is their diagram given by Formlabs. And then here's, again, just an example of how that monomer, or how the resin, or the polymer resin solidifies into a polymer.
So let me ask you, the sample is lying flat, right?
It is actually, let me go back. It's going to be at a 45-degree angle like this.
Oh, I see. Okay. No, that makes sense. Yep.
Yeah. And then supports were used to make sure, again, that it doesn't, just fall off.
I see.
Also, that helps make sure it's uniform throughout.
Mm-hmm.
So then we use the ASTM D6385 dog bone standard, which is an ASTM international standard. You can kind of see that information in this column here, in this diagram there. So then again, here are some images of those dog bones. So here they are right after printing, before the supports were broken off. In some instances, you can kind of see, like back here, where fibers kind of clumped at the beginning of the printing process. I think that might just be a wet spot, but that might also be fibers there. I'm trying to remember. This is definitely fibers right there.
I see. It's so clear. So what's the orientation of fibers, or were they just like mixed in the resin?
Mixed into the resin before being printed.
And do you know, like when you chop the fibers, how long of a fiber it is?
Initially, it wasn't measured. In later testing, we tried to make it 4 to 5 millimeters each. But in these tests here, before our eventual consistency check, it wasn't a uniform lengths of fibers. It was mentioned after the fact to me that that'd be a good idea. So
I see.
my apologies.
Oh, that's great.
You can kind of see, like, that's a fiber, but mostly resin,
I see.
And then again there. And then also these are marked with how the tensile testing, they're marked how they're measured for tensile testing. So the tensile test clamps will grab at these lines as they're perpendicular to the cross section. This line is not a good example of that being perpendicular to the cross section.
Yeah, it's okay.
So tensile tests were performed using the EZLX long stroke test frame with a 5 kilonewton load cell. We used a strain rate of 1 millimeter per minute. And this is just our setup at K-State. So we did some initial experiments with the high Nycalon type S fibers just to determine the concentration of fibers to resin that we wanted to use. And then once we did some created these samples and then did some tensile testing, we use this to as the concentration for the fibers in our comparison later. So here's the data from that. The green here is 0.15 milligrams per milliliter. The blue is 0.6 milligram per milliliter. The orange is a 0.8 milligram per milliliter. And this pink down here is a 1 milligram per milliliter. And then the black is just a neat resin sample. So you can kind of see here the 0.6 milligram per milliliter really outperformed the other concentrations that were tested in the form of elastic modulus as well as its fracture strength. And then here's just the numbers behind that. It's kind of a wall, but see 0.6 milligrams per milliliter had a 500 or nearly 510 megapascal average elastic modulus. The 0.15 actually had a higher elastic modulus, but it wasn't as consistent in this initial experimentation. As you can see here, 560, 493, and 45. Additionally, the 0.6 had a higher average fracture strength, which is another reason that we ended up using this concentration instead. And then you can also see that the 0.8 and the 1.0 even kind of underperformed even compared to a neat resin. And then that was pretty consistent in each of their samples, at the exception of sample 9 here, which had a closer to the neat resin in its elastic modulus.
I see.
So in summary of the initial experiments, we decided to go forward with the 0.6 milligrams per milliliter. They showed an improvement of 24.6% for elastic modulus compared to the neat resin, and a 42.0% when comparing fracture strength to that neat resin.
I see.
So we can jump into the fiber comparisons now. Again, we tested the high Nyclon type S, the ceramic Tirano, the Tirano SA3. And there's that manufacturer's data again. So disclaimer, the next few slides are some testing that was done a little over a year ago by Dr. Singh. So I'm not entirely familiar with these processes. He explained it to me in like 30 minutes yesterday. So
these images?
Yeah, these images, and then there's some additional XRD, Raman surface analysis, and combustion analysis that Dr. Singh did and explained to me.
Yeah.
So I apologize for not knowing everything.
No. We're learning together.
Portion. Yeah. So the high Nyclon had a more consistent diameter at about 13 microns across its sort of samples, and you can see that again here, that they're pretty consistent. Whereas the Tirano actually had some inconsistent diameters throughout. So, you know, this one was at about 10 microns, this was about 15. So the diameter was not necessarily the same in all of the filaments throughout the tow fiber. And then in the ceramic, again, a little more consistent with around 9 or 10 microns for each filament. Oh, and also you can note the Tirano has this, it looks to have some sort of coating on it there and here kind of, which ultimately will likely affect the properties that we examine. Here's the XRD analysis, or the X-ray deflection, I believe is the that Dr. Singh did. So all three of them showed a presence of polycrystalline silicon carbide domains. Kind of see there. They're all very similar ultimately. And Dr. Singh believes this left peak over here is likely like a carbon. And then we can see that the high Nyclon actually seem to have a less ordered silicon carbide domain, just based on how wide this is. And then the ceramic actually seemed very ordered just because of how thin and high this peak is. I don't know if you have a better understanding of just looking at that due to your training.
It is relevant, like relative, I mean.
Then we did, there was Raman surface analysis done, showing some sort of excess silicone done or on the surface, as well as excess carbon in the Tirano and high Nyclon samples. The absence of D and G bands suggests that a well-defined carbon network is not formed in the ceramic specimen, and it's possible that all the carbon is bonded to the silicone. So excess carbon atoms in the Tirano and high Nyclon versus excess silicone in the ceramic. And then also combustion analysis was done. Sorry, what?
I was just saying that makes sense. Sometimes I hear an echo. I'm sorry. Do you hear that echo?
I don't. Let me grab a pair of headphones.
I only hear an echo when I hear myself. I'm not sure.
That's fair. Let me do this.
How's that?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. So jumping back in here, the combustion analysis using bulk composition, so meaning throughout or So the combustion analysis was to test the composition more throughout the fibers, whereas the Raman was just a surface analysis. So we can see presence of oxygen in the ceramic and the high Nicolon, which might suggest the possibility of an SiOC network. Additionally, ceramic appeared to be polycrystalline silicon carbide, while Tyrano is silicon carbide with some graphene or free carbon phase, and that's just due to the one to, like if you look at these as a 1-to-1 ratio of carbon to silicon carbide, or sorry, carbon to silicon. There's just a lot of excess carbon going on in the Tyrano, which leads Dr. Singh to believe that. And then we can see the high Nicolon has a higher carbon to silicon ratio, again leading towards more of some free carbon atoms. Whereas in the ceramic, again, the silicone content is actually higher than the carbon content, which would kind of explain this excess silicone that we observed in the Raman surface analysis. So kind of with that understanding, we can jump into the tensile testing that I did. I apologize, I don't have the best pictures for this type S fibers.
Oh, they look good.
So just from the beginning, where they started out, how they broke. And then here's that testing. Again, this is just that same data from the comparison of the different concentrations from earlier. So again, looking at 509.5 megapascals for the average elastic modulus.
I do have a question before you go. So what concentration is that?
This is for the
0.6?
Yeah, this is the 0.6 milligram per milliliter.
And high Nicolon 1, 2, and 3, those are
that's just
0.6?
Yeah, they're all 0.6. That was for me more than anything else.
I see.
So it's sample 1, sample 2, sample 3, but it's from the same batch of the 0.6 concentration.
I see.
And then did ceramic, and again, you'll see that like S1, S2, S3. That was just for me to differentiate each of the samples from each other. So before breaking or before fracture, fracture after the tensile test, and then again the fracture after, you can kind of see that is not necessarily or consistently breaking in the same spot in each sample. And here's that, the tensile test data gathered from that and the stress strain curve. Pretty consistent elastic modulus, but under or considerably less than that of the neat resin we tested, as well as under the high Nicolon type S at 372 megapascals. And that elastic modulus was consistent throughout the samples we did. Again, these are all from the same batch of resin or fiber to resin mixture. So that may lead to some consistency errors that we'll kind of discuss a little bit later. But they did have a high performing fracture strength. So moving on to the Tyrano samples, again, before, during, and after fracture, I'd like to note, you can kind of see these little lines here where I measured the samples with a digital caliper, which I believe may have influenced how it or where these broke, as well as how they broke and how soon they broke.
Does it press on it too much?
Yeah, I think I just pressed them too hard when I was trying to measure it.
Okay. And is that the location where it broke?
Yeah, you can kind of see, so this is the first one. That's kind of pretty close to where that was. The second one is not so much, but the third one definitely looks like it broke in about the same spot. So I believe that may have influenced the data for that. Which I mainly mentioned because the Tyrano SA3 really underperformed in comparison to these other two commercially available fibers. At 300 megapascals and 15 megapascals fracture strength. We'll just jump ahead to the comparison here. Here you can see the high Nicolon, again, just really performing better than the other two fibers. And the ceramic outperformed the neat resin in terms of fracture strength, but was slightly less in the elastic modulus with the 430 versus 372 megapascals. And then again, the Tirano did underperform compared to the other two, which again may be due to that overpressing with the.
I see. Did that only happen with the Tirano?
Yeah, I didn't notice anything in the other samples. Like here, like you don't see any sort of markings from where I measured them. So I'm led to believe that it was just with the Tirano that was an issue. So it may be worth looking into that. So then I was asked by, I don't know if you know Davi at
in Europe?
No, he's one of Dr. Singh's PhD students. Davi.
Oh yes, I know Davi.
Suarez.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
He suggested doing different batches of the high Nicolon just to show that it's consistent throughout different testing. So, you know, because this came from one batch, so we wanted to see if we did additional batch testing, that it would continue to show this kind of behavior at that concentration. So we went ahead and did that. For these batches, did a more consistent fiber length because it was also brought up to me to try to do that. So we used 4 to 5 millimeters using a razor similar to this right here against a ruler. I say 4 to 5. I was aiming for 4, but I will say that not every single one was likely getting 4 millimeters in length. And then the batch 2 fibers were taken from the same toe. I think that's the same spool as batch 1. And batch 3 was taken from a separate toe and a separate spool. And then 3 dog bone samples were printed from each of these batches, and the same procedure was done. So this is batch 2, which was the same toe, but with more consistent fiber length. You can see during, after, kind of individually, and then against each other, showing how they kind of broke in different places again. And then here's the stress strain curve and tensile test data from that. The batch 2 actually seemed to, with the exception of number 4, which is just the first sample that I tested from this batch, which seemed to underperform compared to the other 2, but did have a higher average elastic modulus, but not necessarily consistent across this batch with 452, 590, and 642 megapascals each. Moving on to batch 3, where we used a different toe, but that the same type of fiber, the same concentration, more consistent fiber length. During, after, and here we could see the high Nicolon S, or the first sample of this batch, actually broke like at half the length of the other ones, and this batch underperformed compared to the other 2 batches in the sense of 464, 428 megapascals for their elastic modulus. I do believe that there was a defect in sample 7, which might explain why it broke here. Because you can kind of see this layer line going on here. My initial guess as to where this came from would be from the layer printing from the SLA printing, but it wasn't observed in the other samples, so I'm not entirely sure that could be the case. And then here is the comparison of all of those batches against one another. So not the most consistent in a sense, but consistently higher fracture strength when compared to the neat resin here.
I see.
And here's just are they consistent? The fracture strengths were consistent, but the elastic modulus covers a wide range, going from 440 megapascals to 562 when we're looking at the average, looking at 428 to 642 when we're looking at individual samples. And then I average that out here, or average all of them. They're still on average 503 megapascals, which is pretty consistent with batch 1. And then conclusions from this data, the high nickel and type S fibers seem to outperform the other tested fibers when looking at elastic modulus and fracture strength. And the ceramic fibers seem to improve the fracture strength and elongation of the neat clear resin, but not by a significant margin. And then the Tirano just seemed to underperform, and this could have been due to that pressing with the calipers that I mentioned.
I see.
Here are my references.
Good. That's great. You've done all of most of this in 2 months now.
Yeah.
That's impressive. It's very good.
Yeah, well done.